just to tell you where we are. So we are a place for innovation, and we gather startups, associations, public and private players to develop reflection and thought about major society issues. And we've been created about 10 years ago, approximately, around tech for good issues. And now we switch a bit and we develop digital commons. So our ambition is to gather communities around big public priorities. So we have now various projects about healthcare issues and environmental transition, agriculture mainly, and water resources. And actually we have a model. So we try to raise funds from private players which are interested in the development of the commons. And at the end, we developed the common with the community, and we handed over the common to public players in open source. So today we have one major project of 2 million euros about cancer, and we try to ameliorate the access to treatment of all patients over the territory. And actually, that's quite all. We mobilize skills in tech and design to do this. And if you want more information, or if you want to join our project, you just contact us, and we will be very happy to explain a bit more about what we are doing. We wish you a pleasant event, and that's all.
So next up, it hasn't escaped your attention that we're in Paris, and we're hosted here very kindly by the French government. And so to say a few opening words, I wanted to pass across. Many of you, particularly those in the call community, will be familiar with Monsieur Henri Verdier, the French ambassador for digital.
Thank you very much. So yes, I'm very happy and proud to welcome you on behalf of the French government. But first I want to thank the Liberté Living Lab to host this event. That's not just because they have a beautiful laboratory. We wanted to connect you with a very vibrant innovation ecosystem that we also have in Paris. Paris is not just about presidential palaces and gold and big lights. This is also this kind of ecosystem, and you are more dedicated to civic tech, if I may, and this part of the innovation ecosystem. So that's on purpose that we are here today. And I hope that we will connect a bit and consider the Liberté Living Lab as friends that you have in France. And then, because I'm supposed just to say welcome and very few words, I just want to put the emphasis on the importance we do attach to the CCIAO, difficult for French to pronounce it. As we said yesterday during the leaders' meeting, personally, but I think that most French consider that free access, the scientific access to data should be seen as a fundamental right. We cannot live in a world where science cannot progress, where science cannot understand what's happening. So, and I see my good friend here, Emmanuel, I'm so exhausted, which was one of those who did inspire the GSA, and which is now at the Ardern, the French regulation agency. As you know, France did work hard to put these rights in the GSA. So in Europe, we are managing now, but research will have access to data. So if there's some researchers coming from France, we will welcome you, install your laboratories in France. This is the best place to make good research now. And yes, because we have access to data, which is the beginning of everything. And this week, we did see the very first progresses, importance of this, because as you have seen, we have the first transparency reports, and we can discover, for example, that Google has 2,300 moderators in English and 50 in French. 50 for France, Twitter. 52.
Twitter.
That's Twitter? So yes. I made the same mistake than my president yesterday. Because I'm a good ambassador. Something that That's scary. France, plus Canada, plus Switzerland, plus Belgium, plus half of Africa, 52 moderators. Why? And do they speak every kind of French, or just the French? I don't know. We need more transparency. And of course, so we have very first results of real transparency, but we didn't manage to access to algorithms. And here we know that this is a bit more sensitive for obvious reasons. One is that to understand the role on how the algorithm functions, we need to manipulate personal data. So we cannot just ask to the company to put everything online. This is pure privacy. What you're looking for, what you do, what your trajectory is pure privacy. And for a second reason that matters too is that this is very often the intellectual property of the companies. And of course we are not asking to the companies to share their intellectual property like this. And it could be dangerous at some point because people could reverse engineer and hack the system very efficiently. So the answer is clear, and we are building this answer here today, that we have to manage to make science able to teach model, to train AI, to think, to ask questions in a secured computing environment. And that we have to develop. And I think that what we are doing is the first collective move. There are some research regarding confidential computing, but I've never seen collective organization, multi-stakeholder working to share these capabilities to the communities. So that's very important, and I also suppose that I finish with this to confirm that France wants to join the movement, and they receive a strong instruction to find €500,000 to be able to co-finance the project. So now I need some months to find the money, but I have a presidential requirement, and we are very, very happy to join the very important movement. Thank you.
So the next speaker is Paul Ash, the New Zealand Prime Minister's Special Representative on Cyber and Digital, and our Christchurch Call Coordinator. And Paul will talk a little bit about the Christchurch Call and how the CCIAO came about.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Henri, and a big thank you to Anais for hosting us here today. It's actually really nice to be in a sort of more intimate atmosphere, and I hope everyone will just relax into the discussion today. But it's great to see old friends here. Some of us are a little tired today, I think, and I want to make sure that people don't feel worried about asking questions when we're doing that. It's very much a working space and one where we want a good collegial, friendly opportunity for people to work through a key issue for us. It's great actually to see you all here from across our multi-stakeholder community. I'm really rapt just to see the level of interest in this work, and that people have hung out until this late on a Saturday, the fourth of the Christchurch Call Summit events that we've hosted over the last couple of days to be here for this discussion. I've got some stuff in here that tells me to introduce myself. I think most of you I already know, but I'm Paul. I work on the Christchurch Call and have for quite a while, since its inception, in fact, the afternoon of the Christchurch attacks 4.5 years ago. I feel a great privilege being able to be here with you today and be able to work on this issue together with you. Similarly, to be able to work with my very, very dear friend, Ambassador Verdier, or Henri as I prefer to call him. I wanted to thank you for the introduction and for your tremendous support and news that France will join the initiative on algorithmic outcomes. If your major demand is that we change the acronym so it sounds better in French, I'm really obliged. It's been a really tricky one to try and explain in a short algorithm, but I know in French something that starts with the two letters C sounds a lot less appealing than it should.
Maybe we can make it something.
Yeah. Cacao. We'll work our way through this. But this isn't just a question for us of new funding, it's actually about building out a community that makes this public good project happen, and also the institutional support that enables us to keep it a public good project over time. I want to start talking a bit about by talking a bit about the project and why it's actually important to us. As most of you will all know, I hope, the Christchurch Call was created following the Muslim attacks in 2019. What we saw there was the internet weaponised as part of a horrific attack on New Zealand's Muslim community. The perpetrator came to New Zealand to commit the attack. He was steeped in online conspiracy theories, and he was supported by a community that works with those theories and helps share the hateful information that they drive, and helped them to carry out the strategy to broadcast the brutal murder of 51 people all around the world. So beyond the live stream in that first week, there were anywhere between 200 and 400 people very, very actively taking that content, putting it on small platforms. You can see him Hadley nodding, pushing it back onto major platforms. I can see Dina Hussain looking knowingly at me, and editing and changing that content frequently. About 800 different versions of that video within the first weekend to try and evade all of the hashing. That wasn't the work of one person, that was the work of a very active community connected online and growing through exposure to content and radicalisation over time. Our response, both New Zealanders and the global community you're part of, was to come together, civil society, online service providers, governments, partners, to try and develop a practical set of commitments that were grounded in a commitment to human rights and a free, open and secure internet. To try and solve for this problem, recognising that none of us can do the job on our own. And while the Christchurch Call focused initially on some of the major issues around live streaming and around crisis response, there are really important commitments inside the 25 commitments in the call for all of those involved, for governments, for service providers and for work with civil society, to try and get to some of the things that lead people to be radicalised in the first place. And, if you want to just take the brutal economics of this, focusing on prevention is always a better option than looking to retrofit solutions after a crisis. If you want to take a human rights perspective, it's a much better way of protecting people's human rights. If you just want to be pragmatic, it's much hard work, but it will reduce the cost and harm right the way through. However you look at it, prevention is where we need to go in the call community to try and ensure that we don't end up in this space again. And as part of that work, we put some commitments in the call at the time. They were actually the toughest ones to negotiate. Some of those involved in the negotiations will remember them. The ones that went to issues around machine learning, algorithmic processes, whether that's detection at speed, whether it's managing upload of live streams of violence, or whether it's the process of trying to understand algorithmic amplification and the way it might lead people from relatively innocuous content to illegal content over time. Those were really tricky to get right at the time. There were really significant privacy issues in the way, there were issues of proprietary information in the way, and we had to try and find a way to break through some of the things that had got in the way of achieving sensible outcomes on that without treading on a range of other human rights issues or a free and open internet. And it's one of the main reasons it's important we have a multi-stakeholder community, because it means we actually get the right perspectives around that discussion. It's been quite telling sometimes as a coordinator looking at people and working with them who've been in the call for quite a long time, and people who've just joined the call, because the folk who've been with us for quite a long time have, I think, really worked through this concept that we actually need to deal with terrorist and violent extremist content, and that hasn't been done well over the years, and it's come with a whole range of risks. Those risks need mitigating in order to deal with the core problem, and we can't focus on the risks as an impediment to doing so. So too with the algorithmic amplification work. As we committed in the call, we have an obligation as a community to study the outcomes of algorithms and other processes that may drive users toward terrorist and violent extremist content, and to develop multi-stakeholder systems for reporting on that. That text was the very last piece of text that was negotiated on the call as we got on a plane to fly to Paris. There are people in this room who were sitting in on that meeting. Some of us in our dressing gowns because we've been up all night in meetings. Some with colleagues who were then in the White House and elsewhere. Needed to get on a plane, but we actually nailed that sentence down with some very, very thoughtful help from some in industry. Actually, we put that multi-stakeholder piece in there as a way to making this safe for everybody. Now, there's a lot of political discourse about algorithms. Many of us have been involved in it. It's not always all that enlightening. the word algorithm has taken on a whole pile of loaded aspects around it, so much so that as early days of the call, some folk didn't want to talk about algorithms at all, and sort of had the word removed from pretty much every sentence. I think we've got past that. Algorithms exist, we all get used to it, they've been with us since the beginning of time, we've all used them to make choices. It's just that now we have machines that do that, and they do it much, much faster than any of us can. Working in the core, what we aim to be around that discourse is practical and evidence-based in our work, and it's taken us time to build the tools that enable us to do that and try and, I guess, depoliticise some of the terms. If we think about algorithmic outcomes and processes, there are very real challenges that go to the question of transparency, visibility, and understanding of how they work. In practical terms, they go to the question of increasingly of young people being radicalised and citing their online user experiences as part of that. And the youth reference group meeting yesterday was fantastic in terms of the clarity that came to us from a grouping of people who have grown up in an algorithmically driven world, who don't actually recall a world prior to the time that their choices were being intermediated electronically as distinct from manually. We also know, though, that insofar as the online environment is the place where people are often radicalised, it's also the place where we can actually design some smart interventions. And to do that, we actually need the tools to understand where radicalisation happens, how it happens, and how we can help at-risk people either at the start of a radicalisation journey or further down it, or communities that risk being re-traumatised by exposure to terrorist content. And we heard yesterday from some folk in those communities about the impacts that has. I guess the second piece in this is that algorithms aren't just about code. We've seen real advances in some measures to make code transparent, but actually we don't understand what that means unless we see it operate on real data. And that real data is not just data, it's actually human beings. And this is fundamentally a question of understanding how humans and algorithms interact and shape user experiences. That's not an easy task, and we've got today a few folk who will be able to help us explain the challenges that get in the way of independent experts getting the information they need, and the challenges for trust and safety teams as they think about understanding the full picture around the social inputs that go into their systems, because this isn't just about machines, it's about people, and about off-platform content that may be contributing to an escalating cycle of violence and hatred. The Christchurch Call Initiative on algorithmic outcomes grew out of an effort to try and materially change the challenges we faced here. It's based on privacy-enhancing technologies that can help ensure researchers are able to ask questions about very sensitive data without compromising the security of the data or the privacy of the users whose data it is. Twitter, now X, was the first call supporter to do work on this system, and they did it with the non-profit OpenMined who are leading the work for us today. I will give full credit to Nick Pickles and to Roman Chowdhury, who I think may pop by today if she's not here already, who at the time were in X and kicked this work off. And they saw the potential to build from it. So last year, New Zealand, the United States, Microsoft and Twitter announced that we were going to work together to develop out a system into a multi-platform tool that can support better understanding of algorithms and users and help us to solve what is now a fundamental social problem. We were really excited today to be able to welcome the team from OpenMined to demonstrate how that works and to have a workshop that gives a real nuts and bolts, gritty experience of just how we're carrying the work out. As we go through the workshop today, I want to note before we kick off, this is a really exciting technology tool. I'm probably too tired to convey just how excited I get about this, but folk on my team have seen me bouncing around the office like a pogo stick, just with excitement about the fact that we're building out something for getting to the core of the way people and algorithms work. And if you haven't seen a 120 kilogram, 6'4" bloke bouncing around the office like a pogo stick, you're probably very lucky. But it's also a really serious issue that brings us together and has defined our purpose for developing. And as we do that, if we can make a difference in this area, if we can reduce the risks of people becoming radicalised to violence, we will have made a really major contribution to the effort to try and deal with the content that comes out of that process and to prevent it being dispelled. What I just want to say before we kick it off though is that it's actually a very, very serious tool and has a number of applications, and as we go through the workshop we want to talk you through some of the things we're going to need to do as we start phase 2 to manage the governance of the tool and the ethics framework that is applied to it to keep it a safe experience for everyone, because we're also acutely conscious that just as algorithms themselves can be used for ill or good, so too can the research access to them, and that needs some real care. Before kicking off, I just want to thank the US and French governments, Microsoft and LinkedIn, not just for their funding and willingness to give this a go, to try it out, but also for the huge amount of additional effort for staff time, computing power, and the political support they've offered to getting this off the ground. I especially want to thank our colleagues from Dailymotion, who kindly opened up their research platform for today's session, and happy for us to see how this works. They've got a really impressive vision for ethical algorithms and researcher access. And I want to thank Andrew and Elysée and the whole team from OpenMined, who developed this amazing solution and also become good friends as we've worked our way through it. Andrew and I are still reminiscing about the concert we snuck out to go and see in New York last year after we announced this. Andrew tells me there's a Madonna concert on tomorrow night. Madonna's not really my cup of tea, but we might find something good to go and get after this is over as well. I'd also like to thank Jiahao Chen, who today is going to talk to us about the perspective of an independent researcher who has been able to test the tool as we've gone through phase 1. I'll stop right there because that's an awful lot to absorb, but I want to hand over to Andrew and ask him to describe the tool, how it works to achieve a better understanding of user journeys.
Excellent, perfect. This is going to be great. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. The whole team has worked really, really hard to put together this infrastructure, motivated by everything that you just laid out. So thank you so much for having us. We're very honored to be here. So my name is Andrew Trask. I lead a community called OpenMined. We're a nonprofit that builds free open source software. I'm here to tell you about the work that we've done over the past year, which was great fun and an honor to be a part of. Maybe before I get started, just for my benefit, civil society, folks with those, academia, civil society, okay, awesome. Online service providers, all right, okay, oh, and governments are doing this, all right, quite a few, excellent, good to see you both. Fantastic, a wonderful cross-section. I'm going to do, go after a challenging thing to say that all of you can get more of the things that you're pursuing. And that's like a difficult thing to do, but that is the goal of the infrastructure we're going to try to put in. More online safety, more better outcomes for algorithms. But I think this actually is a can win for all situation, and that's sort of the vision that we're going to try to lay out briefly. So, a few things we all know. So algorithms already influence how people spend a lot of their time as they're guiding their lives. There are around 8 billion of us running around the world. We're awake for 16 hours a day, some of us more than 16 hours a day, I think, which is roughly 124 billion hours of time. And this is a big deal, because if we ask, what are we spending our time on, 1 billion hours is on YouTube, because it's quite fun, 2 billion on YouTube or Instagram, 3.5 billion per day if we throw in TikTok, and across social media platforms we spend around 12 billion hours a day consuming algorithmically ranked content. And the implication of that is, on average, roughly 90 minutes per person per day. And it's about 10% of our time. Meaning if aliens came down from outer space and said, what is it like to be human right now? 10% of that answer would be looking at things that machines are putting in front of us, right? And this means they're really important. It means they can do extraordinary things that can inform us of all sorts of types of content, but also they're incredibly powerful tools. That influence in a lot of different places. And the reason they're so powerful is that it's not just the 10%, but that 10% is also creating changes in the other 90% of our lives, whether it's the products we buy, the ideas we talk about, the health of our bodies and minds, and all these types of things, right? But the question is that we're not totally sure what the link between these two actually is. How much is that 10% of how humans spend their time changing the other 90%? But there are some things we do know, that we are observing people developing extreme views and becoming violent. And these are outcomes that we need to learn about. And so governments around the world are asking the question, why is this happening? And an even more important subtext, to what degree are these outcomes actually indirect outcomes of this 10% of time that people are spending? But I also want to talk about another opportunity, particularly for our online service providers in the room. Because I want to make the claim that transparency on these issues is actually a competitive advantage. That this is something that is not just about meeting the bar, but about exceeding those around you. So, today in the world, major corporations are increasingly offering AI-driven products and services, AI algorithms, things that are trained to learn. And the value proposition of AI algorithms is that these things can advise or automate our decision making. Right? They can make us faster, more accurate, more scalable. And when we think about the role of a personal assistant or an in-house robot or a self-driving car, what we're doing as an individual, we're taking our decision and we're saying, hey, I'm going to trust this machine to make some decisions for me, but I'm still going to live the consequences of those decisions. I get into a car and it drives me around, or I delegate management of my calendar to some type of assistant. That is an unbelievable amount of trust is required for that to happen. That's different than other types of products and services. And I think that scalable need for trust changes the landscape, because an AI product is only going to be profitable if users can trust it with the decisions more than their competitors, right? Meaning that the degree to which you earn user trust and government trust is a competitive aspect. It's not just about meeting a bar. It is something that you should be thinking about in the proactive sense. Because when users see events like this, they question whether AI products and services can be trusted. And if you want to see this, look at young people today. Look at parents considering whether to expose their children to online platforms at various times. This is a trust question. And so the users are asking, which platforms can I trust most with my data decisions in my life, and how do I find out? And it's this second question, right, that creates this symmetry between these two things. There's the why is this happening, a question that we must ask. But there's also an opportunity that I would say to online platforms to be proactive and to think about this from a value perspective as well. That competing on transparency is a viable business strategy proactively as well. Because I think that winning the race for this new standard, this new higher standard of transparency driven by government and by user expectations, is actually a vicious cycle that can cause a competitive advantage for you. Right? And that there's this more government trust, more user trust leads to more data to train your AI, more data to train your AI leads to superior AI systems leads to more trust and more users, and this is a vicious flywheel. And I think today, if we see that the platforms that we see today embracing transparency and embracing trust are going to be the platforms that are winning 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years from now. Okay, so let's return to this question. And the core challenge that we're going to embrace. This idea that winning the race for user and government trust is about indirect outcomes, right? It's not just what's in the platform, but what happens to people after they leave the platform. What happens in their lives, that other 90% that is almost impossible to measure and share. So that if you actually did fix your platform, right? You might have the best platform out there, but like, how can you demonstrate that to people and lead that to the type of trust and outcomes that we can have in society? Okay. Let's take a quick look at what this looks like. And why the problem of access is so important and so valuable. So if you're an AI company building a product, these are the types of things you see. You'll see user ratings, monthly active users, new KPIs, app conversions. These are the things you're optimizing for. You're tweaking, you're changing things, right? But we care about these outcomes, right? These extreme things we see in the world that we suspect might be related, right? But between these two things, there is an enormous cavern of people living their lives, right? And in this place, there's lots of different outcomes that are positive or negative as people are navigating their life. And our hypothesis is that people do not become extreme overnight. They don't wake up one morning and decide to go do crazy stuff. There's a journey that people go on. And that this journey, these different outcomes, have breadcrumbs in different areas, right? They have different algorithms people are interacting with. They're molding them and changing them as they go throughout their life. And there's this complex interactive dynamic that you were just talking about a moment ago. And that this breadcrumbs exist somewhere, but we just can't see them, right? So if you're say a product developer over here on the left, you can see your own information, but you can't see those of competitors or people in other industries or other types of breadcrumbs or areas people might be in. You can see your own analytics, right? That's what you have the ability to optimize. This is a broken system. Or even worse, if you're an external researcher, civil society, right, remember? Not only do you not have access to this private data breadcrumbed around the world, you also don't have access to the information inside the AI company by default, right? Unless you obtain it. And this is the nature of the problem, right? The people who could do something about harmful algorithms can't access the data to see the harm. So harms go unseen until it's too late, until they present themselves in a way that they can't be missed, right? And this is a multitude of things. People are harmed, user trust is lost to competitors, and government scrutiny is increased and must increase to figure out what's going on. So why is this problem so hard? Let's look a little closer. Let's consider one external researcher and one organization. They say, hey, I'm trying to study an AI algorithm from AI Company Incorporated, right? Can I have a copy of your data so that I can study the degree to which their algorithm leads to lifelong friendships, or whether people become a loner, right? One of the first people they'll meet is the company's lawyer. What will the lawyer say? Hi, I'm the company's lawyer. Your project is awesome, and I believe it can help us earn more user trust relative to our peers and compete in the market. But I think if we were to send you our data, you might use it for another purpose that gets us into legal trouble, right? So I can't give you the data. The next person they meet, the chief privacy officer. Same story. There is a user trust opportunity here, but they have an ethical and legal obligation to protect the privacy of their users. And if they send a copy of that data to an external researcher, that researcher could look up, their ex-girlfriends, their parents, their old boss, all sorts of stuff, right? And invade the privacy of individual users. It keeps going. Chief information security officer, same story. Trust and safety team, right? If you reveal too much information about how content is moderated, this can make it more difficult to do the moderation test, right? Chief executive officer. If you release information to an external researcher, guess what? That external researcher could start a business and go compete with you. These are real concerns. These are the things that actually block access at the end of the day. But look at what they all have in common. Yes, we want more user trust. That's how we compete. We need this. But I can't send you the data to do it. And it's for legitimate reasons. It's because of a genuine ethical conflict between privacy, legal, competitive, and whatever the right opposition of the research project might be. And that's the ethical dilemma that ethics boards are presented with right now, that the different gatekeepers are presented with right now. But here's the deepest underlying problem. In order to answer a question about an AI system, an AI product developer, ethics researcher, safety researcher needs to see a copy of the data of that system in order to do their work. And that's what triggers legitimate privacy, security, IP, legal, and adversarial concerns. And there are many approximate solutions. This one on the left, open access to data, seeing the data. Remote desktop, so zooming in, seeing the data. On-site access, getting on a plane and going into the building, seeing the data. There are additional problems with these that might not be as obvious. Remote desktop and on-site in particular. Let's say an online platform doesn't have demographic data. They don't have ground truth, race, and religion information, and you wanted to do a project saying, does this algorithm discriminate based on race or religion? Maybe you go to the US Census Bureau or UK ONS or the French Statistical Agency and try to get this demographic information. They're not going to give you a copy. It's illegal to give you a copy. So guess what? Remote desktop, not going to help you. Open access, not going to help you. On-site access, not going to help you. And custom API creation, this is where a company builds like a custom web app to facilitate external access, where they have to pre-guess whatever analysis you might want to do. But if they can already pre-guess it, they can do the research themselves, right? This is not as creative, it's a constraint. But all this comes from this underlying problem. In order to answer a question about an AI system, an AI product ethics safety researcher needs to see a copy of the data about that system. And this brings us to our hypothesis for what the solution is. To empower researchers to answer important questions about algorithms without seeing a copy of the data they use to answer the questions. Okay, civil society researchers, I know that sounds scary, right? What do you mean I can't see the data? I need to. I'm a data scientist, I'm a researcher, I get it. Before we jump into the more practical, we're going to show this very specifically how this can work. The general paradigm is you already use a set of tools to work with data that is too big for you to see, gigs and terabytes of data, and those transfer over surprisingly well to data that's just too private for you to see. It's a high-level thing. We'll come back. Okay. So, we're going to talk about a thing called remote data science. This allows an external researcher to create some data science code, submit it to an organization, and download the answer to their question without seeing the underlying data. Cool? So let's look at how it works. We're going to talk about a library called PySift between a researcher and an organization. This blue box, online service providers, this is your computer. This is a server that you run. This guy over here, in the blue circle, this is digital service providers. This is someone who works for, is your employee, right? Someone who works for you, someone you trust. What's the first thing he's doing? He's loading algorithm metadata into the server. So this is like model weights, data sets, user logs, whatever they think a researcher might want to study. Second thing he's doing? Creating a username and password for an external researcher and specifying question limitations. Some questions are okay, like what causes cancer? Some questions are not okay. The difference between use and misuse is about what question you're answering, not about seeing the data or not seeing the data. It's different. Okay, then he goes away. Data's in the server. It's up there all the time. Server's there to enforce the policy of the organization. Allow questions to be answered that are important and prevent questions to be answered that could be harmful or an ethical violation. So meanwhile, researcher, civil society. You guys have really raised your hands, okay? Civil society, external researcher, logs in using their credentials, uses a variety of privacy-enhancing technologies that we'll go into more in a second to generate answers to an allowed set of questions. There is actually an animation happening, I think. There we go. And here's how this works. They're going to create some code, they're going to submit it to the server. Organization is going to review the code and execute it if two things are true. First, if the question is a legitimate question. It's a question that passes the ethical tests of the organization, privacy, security, etc., etc. And two, is the way that they're asking the question valid? Right? And it could be invalid for all sorts of interesting reasons. You know, they thought the data was one thing, it's actually another, was collected a different way, all sorts of things. It ends up being a collaborative relationship. So it gets approved, code gets run, researcher downloads it, and the researcher's still in their pajamas at some coffee shop. Right? Didn't have to go on site. Didn't have to travel somewhere. In a different country, even. You know what also matters less in the situation? Whether the researcher is a super prestigious academic from a major, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because they never see the underlying data. It becomes all about, is this question worth answering? And that is a totally different paradigm than, do I trust this person to see this data? Does that make sense? Okay, let's keep going. So what does this look like in the context of our situation a moment ago? Researcher, external, starts studying data at an organization. Okay, what percentage of users start losing touch with their friends? Of those, which ones have a mental health breakdown? Of those, which ones join a radical extremist community? Uh-oh, we found something. What happens next? They issue a report. They issue a report describing the problem, describing how it could be improved. How can we change algorithms to lead to better outcomes? And guess what happens? The company's then able to update their algorithm. And guess who reruns their research? One more time. And the idea here is that this feedback mechanism can facilitate the information flow across different organizations that can allow for improved outcomes. There was no part of this where the researcher needed to see stuff about individual people. It's about changing the algorithm to lead to better outcomes because outcomes can be measured at a high statistical level. Right? We can answer important questions while preventing harmful or unethical questions from being answered. Okay, we've done half of it. And we'll see more details about exactly, for the researchers in the room, we'll see more details about how the not sync data works. What about proper ethical oversight? There's one more attribute of this that's particularly interesting. Because the data doesn't need to be centralized into one location, it stays distributed, first ethical check. In order to study data at 5 different or 4 different places, guess how many different organizations have to sign off on ethical oversight? 4 different organizations. Additionally, because the data is never copied out of the servers, It's operating over a network, which means you can put arbitrary regulators, arbitrary ethical boards, arbitrary academics, civil society groups, whatever, who should be the proper check and balance in between the researcher and the information they're looking for to review projects and answer two questions. Is this an ethical question that should be answered? And is this the right way to specify it? Right? And this creates all the flexibility from a tech stack standpoint that allows ethicists and political scientists to craft a very flexible ethical oversight paradigm that the tech is going to conform to. Right? It's not the tech driving ethics, it's the ethics driving the tech, and the tech just being flexible enough to adopt that. Okay, so now we've got both. So now let's talk about what we've shown. And this is the fun part. So Christchurch Call Phase 1, this year, we're focusing on demonstrating that external researchers can answer questions leveraging private assets without seeing the data. Meaning, does this new process actually solve problems for legal, security, policy, privacy, CEO, these different stakeholders that have their own ethical paradigms that it's their job to protect? So what do we do? Set up servers, found some external researchers, one of whom you're going to hear from in a moment. Executed a handful of projects across geographies, across legal jurisdictions, right? Some of these servers are in, Dailymotion, GBR in Paris, yes? Microsoft LinkedIn in the United States, CCPA, I think, yes? Yes?
GDPR.
Oh yeah, GDPR. Yeah, exactly, of course. Again, technologists. I defer to the experts. And here's a handful of researchers able to do a variety of projects from a variety of different geographic locations, right? Without having to travel, without spending tons of money on all sorts of different things that involve going on site or building custom web applications, all these types of things. And you'll learn more about this in a moment. Here are the types of questions that were explored. You'll see more about these in a moment as well. And so the precedent is that external researchers can answer questions leveraging private assets without seeing the data. A special thank you to LinkedIn Dailymotion, who are really active this year. Did a lot of extra work. I know folks are here as well. I'm very, very grateful for your kind of willingness to pioneer responsible AI infrastructure and technology. And I wanted to close before I hand it over to actually see a closer look at technology with one appeal to folks similar to Dailymotion and LinkedIn. I think that there are two styles of triaging these types of ethical concerns and transparency programs at online service providers. One style is a little bit of an older style that is a little more about public relations and risk management, just about triaging bad things when they happen and managing as they come in. Procedurally, it works that way. And what I would like to argue is that with the new regulatory frameworks that we're seeing, and with the leaning into AI algorithms and all of the user trust that that's going to require, that there are two different ways to run a tech policy triaging ethics organization. And one of them is very conservative and is reactive, right? When bad things happen, when someone finds something bad on our platform, a researcher will go and look into it and then we'll solve that problem, right? And that's going to lead to, a few dozen major projects each year, major programs, this type of stuff. Problems identified and solved. That forms a record of what users can trust in your platform. A different way is to be proactive and to scale up your external access and scale up your transparency and leverage more talent from around society to find and fix problems. Over time, what's the difference between these two different styles? One of them will have a backlog of maybe a dozen major projects a year, problems found and fixed. The other one could have hundreds or thousands of problems found and fixed. A few years down the road, which one are you going to trust more? The one where they only found a few things and only fixed a few things? Or the one where a big pool of people have been constantly working with, finding and fixing, and you know that those problems have been solved because people went and looked? And my hunch is that if I was a tech policy person, and I've worked with many tech policy people in these types of roles, is that 2, 3 to 4 years from now, these are the ones who are going to absorb the user trust and start experiencing lots of success amongst all the most skeptical subgroups. And that will create a certain degree of phone calls from CEOs to their trust and safety, legal policy saying, hey, how come they're getting all the trust? What's going on? Well, it's because they have this huge backlog of external research projects and audits and all this kind of stuff saying, look at how awesome our outcomes are, right? And this puts someone in the future into a tough spot, because it means not only are they behind on finding and fixing problems in their own platform, but now in order to catch up, they've got to have a rough time. They're really peeling off the Band-Aid and finding and fixing a lot of things to catch up, and that would be a difficult position to be in if I was in that role. So I hope that I've made the case that it's not just about reaching some kind of level that you're sort of forced to, but there's a competitive dynamic here, and we're asking people to delegate their decisions over to algorithms and AI systems and spend 10% of their lives embedded with these systems. Okay, enough on that. Thank you so much for being here. Special thank you for LinkedIn Daily Motion. Allow me to hand it over to folks to show us a little more about the tech.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for the introduction, David. So now we're going to do a live demo of how one can audit an algorithm of a company that you usually don't have access to. The whole presentation is structured around the daily motion steps to enable external access to algorithmic outcomes. We'll first dive into the high level of what was the process for daily motion from the commitment to the Christchurch Call till answering actual research questions using algorithmic metadata. We'll go into, zoom into the data collection, how was it like, how you can answer meaningful questions with such data, how you can enable external access, and therefore take you through the whole workflow of answering such questions using PySIF, what Andrew was showing before. So that's pretty much how it looked like. So there was the commitment at the beginning last year. There was the data collection process where we're like answering the question of like, what are the algorithms of Dailymotion and how can we help external researchers ask meaningful questions about them. Then we launched the server, the blue box, and then we loaded data into it, made it available for researchers who now got access to it. We're able to propose questions they would like to have answers to, and then the employee from Dailymotion, an admin, was supporting researchers into conducting their studies. So the data collection. What questions should be answered by researchers? So as all of you know, Dailymotion is a video streaming company that relies on AI recommender systems for their videos. The systems for serving videos use multiple AI algorithms and the rule to decide which one is being used. For example, the algorithms recommend next videos based on, for example, collaborative data, such as user interactions and video metadata, which would be like Algorithmic, or simplistically only on the metadata of the initial video and the candidate videos, which would be Algorithmic MC. Additionally, there are other algorithms and human-rated outcomes which are used to score individual videos, in particular for detecting suggestiveness, which is what we call harmful content that could, for example, contain artifacts of like violent nature. So then, knowing that this is how AI algorithms are used by Dailymotion, the question is what type of data could enable external researchers to study meaningful algorithmic outcomes? So one solution, among many others, is using impression data. So impressions is how many times a content unit, for example, posts, tweets, videos, was recommended by an algorithm and viewed by users. This is important because it helps researchers understand if algorithm amplifies a specific type of content or not, and moreover, if the amplification happens to specific attributes, such as toxicity, political parties, gender representations, and so on, which are problems we all care about. Let me guide you through what was the dataset schema that Dailymotion proposed to researchers. So, this data contains multiple videos, and for each video, metadata is provided, such as title, description, tags. There is the number of recommendations, so how many times it was recommended by a specific algorithm, which algorithm was used to recommend it, and then the suggestiveness score, which is an AI-based score of how harmful the content of the video is. This is not everything they could offer. Based on the interactions with the researcher, this could be expanded, and it was expanded in order to answer more ambitious research questions that our researchers had. Now, let's see how enabling external access looks like. So, what Emmanuel presented before, we would launch this domain server, and that's where I'm still running some code. Our library, PySift, is a Python API, so that's why I'm going to run some Python code. So bear with me while I'm doing so. So here we basically launch such a node, the blue box, and then we access the actual Dailymotion node as an admin. Now that we have access to the node, what we want to do is to make the data available through it. So how do we do it? I'm going to go back to what Andrew was saying, that the researchers never work directly with the data, the private data, but the fake version of it that mimics the private one in terms of the dataset schema, the categorical values, numerical ranges, and so forth. And this is something that the data owner creates. So it can be completely fake, further away from the private data, or it can be as close to the private data as they feel comfortable to empower the researcher to work on. Why fake or mock data? If you remember the possible solutions to external access, mock data can be distributed in an open access fashion and accessible by absolutely anyone. It is the foundation to propose research questions and research code to be actually executed on the private data, and it also offers the researchers a testing environment for their analysis. In the meantime, the actual private data is securely hosted and only accessible by the Dailymotion admin, who can execute these proposals and make sure that the answers get back to the researchers. So here I'm just going to load some data from disk. That's how the data looks like. It's the schema I was showing before. And then we create a data set, which pretty much explains what the data set contains. We upload this data to the server, and now we can see the data is there, it's available. It's a smaller subset. Don't imagine the data was this small. In fact, it captured 1% of Dailymotion's videos. So quite a huge size. And that's the data. It's available in a mock format to the researcher to explore. The node is running, the data is there. The only thing that is missing is the researchers. So at this point, we want to give access to the researchers. But before doing so, Dailymotion might ask themselves, who should be allowed access? So the first step before giving access is conducting a background check of possible candidates to understand the incentives of the ODT or researcher. This includes affiliation, motivation for conducting the project, the type of questions intended to be answered, or how they would plan to use the results. Once this is approved, and it's mostly on the table of the legal and the policy folks, stakeholders of these companies, then access is just creating a set of credentials, and we did so. So now I'm going to move next to how we can answer research questions using PySift, and this is a ping-pong, a workflow between the researcher and the admin. So that's why I split my screen into two sides. On the right we have the admin, and on the left we have the researcher. So the admin doesn't have to do anything, they're just now waiting for incoming research proposals because they've done their job. But the researcher, now they want to retrieve the mock data and try to come up with possible research questions to answer. So therefore, they access the domain server, they get access to it, and now they will try to come up with their research proposal. But first, in order to come to the research proposal, they will have to understand the data. So they will read description, data dictionaries that were provided by the admin to understand the data and the data structure. And then they will actually look at how the data looks like. So these are the columns, that's how the fields look like. And I think now, as a researcher, I know what is the question that I want to answer. So, formulating the question in this demo, the question we'll try to answer is highly suggestive content amplified by Dailymotion's algorithms? Highly suggestive content, just a reminder, is posts that are flagged by internal AI algorithms and human raters to contain violent or sexual artifacts. First step, I got my question. Now I want to share it with the admin. So I'm going to introduce the research question to be studied via a project proposal. And I must remind myself that it must align with the motivation stated during the background checks and legal agreements. So now I create a project which specifies my intention. And now I have to propose the audit code. A project consists of multiple audit code requests that show how the researcher is intending to conduct this study. Specifically, it shows the admin what data is used, how, and its exact output. So, how do code requests work? A code request is a remote code execution request that is written by the researcher on their own machine, locally using the mock data, and then it must comply with the admin organization's use-misuse policies. Then they can test it on the fake data for correctness, and then they can submit it for review with the purpose of being run on the private data. Now, I said that the code must comply with the data usage and release policies. How do these things look like? So, for example, some of them were also part of the Dailymotion's policies, but more broad. So, for example, a data policy would be that you can only release computational results that contain aggregate statistics, or aggregate statistics with differential privacy, or illustrative very small samples of the data. But you might never share computational results that contain information that can be used to identify individuals. And these rules were shared with the researchers ahead of the study. So now we're going to design a few code requests together. For example, as part of my research question, I'm curious to know if most popular videos are more suggestive or not. And the methodology, I will assume, is that popular is like top 10 videos by number of recommendations within the platform. I will investigate if the suggestiveness score of popular videos is higher than the platform average, and then investigate if any of the algorithms contribute more to the popularity of suggestive content. So I literally write the code I want to be run on private data, which follows the steps I was mentioning before, and therefore I run the code. And I can also test it, as I was saying, using the mock data. And when I run it, I must check that the method works, and then that the output corresponds to what we would like to learn from the private data. Otherwise, we go back, we change, and then we rerun till we are happy with the result. We design a second code request. How do outlier videos, like the ones with the highest suggestive score and the highest number of recommendations, look like? Similarly, there's a methodology attached to it. So for each algorithm, with an estimator, we see the relationship between the suggestiveness score and the number of recommendations. We extract these outliers, and then we inspect the outliers manually to look for unusual patterns in the behavior of the algorithms. Similarly, we wrote the code, and now we can test it on the mock data. Oops, I didn't run the method above. Okay. And once this is done, might take a second or two, we'll be able to submit the project and the corresponding code requests. Okay. All done, they are pending. So now I'm just going to wait for review and approval for my project submission. Now it's the admin, the Dailymotion employee time to shine. So now they will be reviewing. They will be reviewing the code that was sent to them. This involves reviewing, deciding whether the requests are compliant with the organization's requirements, and then therefore approve or deny accordingly each request. So they connect to the actual node as an admin. Okay, and then they look what is the purpose of this project. We see that the researcher wants to study the relationship between suggestiveness scores and the degree to which algorithms deployed by Dailymotion are amplifying such content. And then we see there are 2 code requests attached to it, aiming to cover this study. Because the project proposal looks interesting and it's aligned with the initial motivation, we can there further review what has been sent. If you remember, the admin would be responsible to enforce the data usage and release policies stated before. However, while this has been done manually to give the most comfort to the Dailymotion admin, in the future some of the policies can be enforced through automatic ways, making more leverage of different paths available. So first, they can look exactly what the code that has been sent to them looked like, and then understand whether it is compliant or not. In this specific case, it is because it releases only aggregate statistics and does not release any information about an individual. The second one, however, we look that was its purpose, and then we see that its output is actually a very small sample of the videos, which reflect to be considered outliers. So again, the highest suggestiveness or number of recommendations or both. Now I need you to pay an extra bit of attention to me because we're going to do an interactive exercise. So to answer an open governance question. So basically releasing a very small sample of isolated, highly suggestive or highly recommended videos does not reveal personal information. We know that. However, it could possess a few possible risks. For example, it can have an indirect impact on content creators. Researchers can learn patterns of the recommender system and then maybe gain a competitive advantage on the platform. Maybe. There could also be privacy and consent implication because the analysis would reveal videos that were considered most toxic on the platform, and this could potentially harm the reputation or privacy of the content creators. Now, this is going to be an interactive governance question, which I would like you to brainstorm with the 2-3 folks next to you about what would be the answer to it. So, is it ethical to release such a very small scale sample, given possible risks for the platform users, as long as it helps us tremendously advance our understanding of algorithms? I'm going to give you 3 minutes, and then we'll see what the audience think of this question. This is something that the data managers, the admins, would face many times, and that's why it calls for like an ethic governance board and different types of systems to help alleviate this kind of problems. So feel free to chat with the folks next to you, get to know each other.
I have seen the presentation. I'm not convinced. All the presentation before was included.
I know it's a super interesting question to debate on. Okay, so I want now those of you who think that data should be released to the researcher to raise a hand. That should be released. Like, should this data get to the researcher? Okay, we have a few hands up. We have a few Dailymotion hands up. And I assume the rest of you would say no to releasing this information.
That's very binary. Some of us are maybe.
Oh, maybe. Who's in the maybe? Who's in the maybe? Okay, some of you. Anyone would like to share the reasons for their decision?
I think that the maybe really comes from is the content in a explicitly closed space, like a private Facebook group, a Discord server, just theoretically, or is it available publicly, like on Instagram or just in a YouTube video feed? I'm just trying to use any platform for the sake of this. So I think if it's public, then yeah. If it's private, then no.
Just to answer quick, the videos are all public, so there's no private information.
So I think that it's not only a matter of privacy and consent, what this sample could reveal. It could profile people, it could bring up some information about a specific community that is usually vulnerable and that can be abused. So it's not only the matter of privacy, like it's a more community and especially vulnerable communities' interest that I would say no, do not release it. Also, we are considering that these researchers are all benevolent actors.
Yes.
And well, I doubt that. I think we have to verify, but
Thank you so much.
The non-binary person.
I'll be non-binary for the purposes of this question. But, I think it goes to the question there of accreditation and researchers and the purpose of the research. There may well be environments where you would not want people to have access to the data depending on who they are. Part of it depends upon the ethics framework that's built and the researcher access accreditation process that's built. And there may be environments where it is feasible to do research that does throw up some quite sensitive information, but it's still in and of itself not linked to a particular user or a vulnerable community, but from whom you may actually be able to make some inferences. But that would then require a different set of ethical constraints around both the researchers who have access to it and the use to which it can be put. So I think there's a bunch of algorithms you'd need to run through to actually make that decision clear.
Thank you so much. One more?
This is actually a question. I think I was maybe on the more maybe side as well, but just to understand how this all works. As a government person, I'm not an expert on any of this. But the answer to that question, would that be dependent on the two questions that Andrew was talking about? So is there in this, where the administrator have to answer that question of releasing data and information, is that dependent on those two questions? And does that go into a wider harm prioritization? So if it's dependent on whether this could be something that, if the researcher question was, this can potentially lead to an act of terror or very, very severe offline harm, then would the answer be yes? Or if the researcher question is more of a, something out of still curiosity and importance, but not, it doesn't need to sacrifice then the privacy concerns here.
Yeah, that's a very beautiful way to put it, and I think that's where we land. Basically, the research question at the beginning is linked directly to those two questions. Is this violent content being amplified by the algorithm? And that's what we try to study with this request. And our perspective, it's of course very subjective, and each admin of each company might have a different answer on it based on their users, their data, and their, of course, stakeholders and rules. But from our perspective, it should be approved. So first, on the intent of what will be done with the specific outputs and findings of the study, the initial legal agreements can already state the bounds of how the findings can be used. On the competitive advantage, in reality, such a very small scale of data, outliers, can hardly allow someone to build an advantage. And at the same time, a real sample, in particular because it is harmful content, provides significant understanding to the researcher of the data and can meaningfully help the company improve their systems. So that's our take on it.
Sure. I was going to say this, what if the company decides, even with the researchers' feedback, that they don't want to implement any changes because it's not financially, makes sense for them?
So I think that's where this tool is trying to sort out some technical challenges between the relationship of three different groups, right? Civil society is a group, governments is a group, private sector is a group, right? And so what you just said is, you want to say that in the mic again? No?
I was just asking, once the researcher gives the feedback, if the company decides that they don't want to implement it or the devs don't want to make any changes, then because it's likely not financially in their interest or they don't see the benefit of implementing that feedback, then what do you do?
So nothing about this infrastructure forces people to change their algorithms. It's a tool to understand and create clarity around what's going on. So for example, to create clarity on whether improvements did happen, for example. So then you can have a coherent conversation between governments and civil society and the private sector on what the best way forward could be, should be, must be. Thinking, and I think that's. I'm not a government representative, so I'm getting on the diving board. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think just to say, I think what we've done just now has exposed some of the really interesting governance challenges with a tool like this, and we are getting to governance in the next section, so we have a really good chance to talk about that. But one of the things that we're looking for is to create a system that's multi-stakeholder, that gets inputs from all of the people involved in this, so that we can create the right framework for it. So that's just a thing to mark down as for the next set of conversations.
Could I just throw a quick point in there on that? I don't know if this is working or not, but just on that piece, one of the key things here for the Christchurch Call community is actually building a stronger evidence base for policy and other interventions. And it may well be that changing the algorithm is one of the answers, but it may well be that there's a range of other solutions as well. Understanding the right sort of intervention points for a positive intervention, connecting with some of the partners that we have that are building and designing positive interventions based on machine learning. Some of the great work that the likes of Muflahoon is doing might be something that would tap in really neatly there. So there may be a bunch of policy solutions that sit outside the company that come off the back of this. So the key here is actually building a really smart evidence base that means we can design smart policy interventions that may range from technical right the way through to a range of other tools. And without that evidence base, it's really hard to do that.
Okay,
Can I respond to that a little bit? I come from real life. We've had cases in New Zealand, and we work on them, and I won't mention what they are, not just March 15th, but also other ones. The word evidence-based is very loaded because evidence from a particular perspective can be seen as, hey, this is key information for me. Evidence from the other perspective will say, hey, this confirms that you are on the radicalization path. Two different perspectives, the same evidence. We come across that in 3 cases of a legal nature. I think the approach is good. It's not a governance issue, it's actually the metrics you use I've not seen yet. You're talking in terms of the sample size, but what is the metrics that are being used? I'm a layperson, but we've got a team also working on algorithms at the moment from our faith perspective. We've got a whole lot of people working on that one. But what we're trying to find out is what are the metrics you're using in terms of specificity for determining the sample size for that way. And then the content itself. Although it's not the real content, it's the image copy from it.
It's a fantastic question. So for phase 1, we're piecing up this challenge into different chunks. For phase 1, we've just focused on specific challenges that prevent getting access to broad swaths of metrics because you just don't have access to the underlying data. What metrics, tools like this should then be used to go after? It gets closer to the governance and ethics framework of what the topics are, which I think coming up next in that sense, but it's the right next question.
Just to note, this is not a tool for looking for vulnerable individuals per se, or looking for opportunities for individual interventions or law enforcement interventions. That's not what this is for. This is a research tool to try and understand the way that algorithmic processes and user data interact, and then to use that as a base to start to design some policy tools that would enable prevention rather than detection, if I could put it that way. So there's some nuances in there, but it's really important that that point is very, very clear. The last thing we want is a tool like this to be subjected to the likes of lawful access requests in a way that actually prevent researchers effectively being able to go about designing safer systems. And it's been, we've seen this in crisis response and a number of other areas of our work, that there's a tension at times between the structures around investigation and prosecution and intervention, and those that are designed to actually build safer systems in the first place that make it much, much harder for platforms to be exploited and for individuals to be radicalised online in the first place. And that does require a multi-stakeholder approach. We'll come back to in the governance piece.
Thank you all for all the interventions. You were holding your hand up all the time, so I'm just going to hand you the mic. This is the last intervention.
Thanks. I'm curious what you're imagining for information that comes back on the decision making of a company. So for instance, if the decision is no, or is no for a part and yes for another part, does the company have to provide or is intended to provide a rationale for that decision? And will that be tracked anywhere centrally? Because I imagine it would be very interesting to see, for instance, if a particular reason begins to be used significantly across industry or by one particular company. And then I guess the second question is, has there been any thinking about what parts of companies are likely to be responsible for making these decisions? Because I can imagine a trust and safety lead versus a lawyer versus a public policy person or an ads person will all get you to very different places. I assume that every company is going to have their own decision-making process, which is fair, but will even that be made public to the people that are engaging?
I might give that one to Andrew. Sure. And maybe Paul might as well.
From a tech stack standpoint, all that can be recorded and whatever information flows are appropriate for the governance framework can be implemented. As far as whether it will be, I would probably point you to things like DSA Article 40 and like the ethics and governance conversation we'll have in a moment. So one thing is, as a technologist, I found it to be really important to like be the technologist and also not be the governance policy kind of sort of ethics person as well. Like our goal is to design technology that adheres to the standards that someone like yourself does. So if you ask me, can the technology do it? Absolutely. There's nothing about what you just said that is not possible. In terms of whether it will, I imagine different regulatory regimes will have their own individual preferences for how they triage these types of things. I think DSA Article 40 is probably one of the more innovative proposals that does have carve-outs for those provisions. I don't know if you want to comment on that as well. But, yeah.
I think, Rose, that's a question we can come back to. I'd love to hear from Jiahao and Irina just to finish this piece off. But what I would say is what we're trying to do here is ensure that we can establish safe researcher access to first understand what's happening, and that the pieces we build on top of that around what choices and decisions are then made thereafter come at a sort of higher level above the stack. But at the moment we actually don't even have the tools to do that safe research. Once the research is done safely, and I come back to Andrew's two questions around the two almost decisions and thresholds that have to be met to do the research, then the safety around the content that comes back. It's a matter then of designing and building the processes as to what to do about it. And I would imagine some firms would treat that quite differently from others. There'll be some firms that go, this is a really useful contribution to our work and we can see how that will help. There may be others that go, ooh, that wasn't what we expected. And that's a subsequent set of discussions I think that we need to work our way through. But the key here is actually designing a safe platform to be able to open up some of those questions in a field of study. That means we can then start to build some of the infrastructure on top of it.
Thank you very much, all of you, for the great conversation we had. I think it puts some light on the challenges that the company has into deciding what shouldn't be approved and what should be the ethics framework and the governance frameworks that should be designed around this. Moving forward, I'm going to take for granted that it's approved. So at this point, before approving, we can actually see as an admin what are the exact outputs that are going to be seen by the researcher. So I'm going to run the first function on the private data, and I know this is exactly what the researcher will see. And I'll do the same for the second request. Whoops, sorry, small. Never coded with a microphone in my hand. This is going to take a few seconds, but then what we're going to see is basically a sample of the data. And once that's ready, here we go. It's a very small sample, 3 items. And then we can actually just approve the requests that have been sent. And now we just wait as an admin to see what the researcher can extract from those computations, what are his findings and conclusions, and what can be actually improved in our platform.
Just to signpost one thing, for all the platforms that have built custom applications, everything from ChatGPT to everything else, often these query systems release information before anyone's able to have a conversation about what information is being released. What you just saw is really important, because not only are you able to see the code in your sort of ethical framework, you're also able to see the results and process that in your ethical framework when deciding what to release. So if you're playing with the ChatGPT app or something like that, stuff is just spitting back, it's going out, it's in the logs, you can see what already went out, all these types of things, but it's much more difficult to wrap that into your ethical framework and design the specific information flows you want to have happen in these interactive apps that are constantly releasing information all the time. There's a time and place for them, they're appropriate, there can be good things for them, but for particularly sensitive issues, when you want to have really, really precise governance and ethical decisions, being able to withhold it and take all the information in when making a legal, policy, governance, ethics decision is really valuable, and that's an intentional feature.
Can I ask you a clarifying question? The 30 approvals that you just did,
Yeah.
were for the 3 specific pieces of content?
That's a great question, and it's something I didn't cover specifically, but when the researcher specifies their code request, they must, through some policies which are built into the framework, they can specify what goes in and what goes out of the method, and for example, they must provide exactly the data set that code must be run on, and how many times it is requested to be approved for running. So this is built into the framework, so this will release exactly the answer for the exact code that was sent, and in the reality, this might require a few more iterations to get the code right, because there might be like incongruences between the mock and private data, and these are being worked through iteration. So it's a collaborative work between the company and the researchers to figure out how to solve these problems. And yeah, for example, you could have denied it, so you could have provided the reason why this would not have been approved. Now the researchers will get their questions, and I'm almost done. Thank you for bearing with me. They will see exactly the output that the admin saw before approval, and now they can either submit follow-up requests to make sure that the question they wanted to answer is properly answered, or finalize their study and present their findings. And of course, if specific issues were raised through the study, the company can work to improve the system accordingly. This is mainly the end of my live demo. We prepared as well a chance for the people in the audience who would like to take the auditor hat to basically submit your own research proposals to the Link and Dailymotion servers. If you scan that QR code, it basically points you to like a Google Colab where you can actually have instructions on how you would do all the steps I presented before, and also you have the endpoints so you can reach their servers. And the idea here is the best proposals, which are worth to be studied further, will be chosen by Link and Dailymotion, and you will be again run against the private data, so you could even get the answers to your questions. And that's it for me. I'm going to hand to Jiahao, who was one of our researchers within the Christchurch Call Phase 1.
Thank you all for being here on a Saturday afternoon. My name is Jiahao. I'm an independent researcher. I have a little consultancy which is called Responsible AI LLC. Apparently nobody took this name in New York State, so now it's mine. Thank you all for being here. I again want to reiterate, this would not be possible without the generous cooperation of the companies here, LinkedIn and Dailymotion. So thank you again for being part of this pilot exercise. Thank you very much to the Christchurch Call for getting me involved, and also sponsoring my flight here. This was great. Why should you listen to me? I have a bit of a complicated history, so I did my PhD in scientific computing. I've always been interested in how computers can understand the world. I stayed in academia way too long. I graduated in 2009. Not a good time for industry jobs. 2016 happened, the deep learning revolution was up, I was really interested in all of this machine learning stuff happening outside of academia. I made the transition to industry, ended up in banking, and became really frustrated and then very interested in the compliance regimes that make data science work complicated and inefficient in banking in the US. I also founded a company to try to look at taking the things that we learned from banking, applying it to other regulated industries like healthcare and employment. And that's how I ended up here today as an independent consultant. I have gotten actually a lot of interest in what I do from government agencies and some companies as well, in terms of how can we better do AI governance and risk management, specifically taking into account the lessons that we have learned from other industries that have had to deal with these issues for decades. I'm still an academic researcher. I'm involved in Europe at some point. Happy to talk about this. But this is me. I just thought I'd start from my perspective on this, which is why is this a thing that we want to do at all? And AI assurance is now something that is very popular to talk about in terms of understanding how do we do governance of AI systems. And really there are three emerging themes here. One we'll talk about today, which is algorithmic auditing. But there's also incident reporting, having a public database of things that have happened. So like taking inspiration from aviation safety, civil engineering, that kind of thing. And also we see like red teaming and bias bounties as another way of trying to interrogate systems. In the interest of time, I'm only talking about the first one. And it's not just algorithmic auditing, but it's algorithmic auditing with pets. This is my personal copy. This personal copy is on social media since the topic is social media. All right, so what is it like to do an algorithmic audit as an auditor? So this is a fairly typical setup of what I have to deal with clients. And really, the point here is that it's very heavily gated. The company sits on in their box, I sit in my box. And I have to somehow convince them to give me a copy of their data, and then I do all the work on my side, and then like when I have my findings, I have my discoveries, I write them up, I send them over. What does this look like from the auditee's point of view? Okay, well I literally just sent over all my data, and then a black box of nothingness happens for 3 months, and then I get back an essay saying like, here are all the things you did wrong. And this is the current state of auditing right now. It's very adversarial. It takes time to get approvals to isolate the data, send it over. You need time to wait for the researchers to do their work. And I think you just get like loss of control, which I think for all the reasons that we've talked about already and probably we'll hear later, there are good and bad things about this current issue. One thing to point out is that receiving a copy of the data poses a massive privacy and security risk, not just for the companies, but for me as an auditor, because I am now a source of potential cybersecurity attacks. I can be subpoenaed if it came to that. So there are issues on the auditor side, there are risks on the auditor side to be controlled as well. What we heard about so far, first of all, Irina is extremely brave to do a live demo. I am not so brave, I prepared everything beforehand. Excuse me. What we're showing here is how we can use the setup from PySift together with technology for differential privacy to present what I think is a world first, which is algorithmic audits that are aware of privacy issues. The difference here is, I want to point out that it's inherently collaborative in nature. And I'll talk about why this is important. You see, I don't get the data, but I send my computations over. So they get to see what kind of analysis I want. They get to retain control over what they want to approve, what is compliant and non-compliant with their own policies. And we work together to interpret the results and refine it for further testing. I think this last bit, the fact that there is an interactive component of review is actually really important because not only does it give autonomy to auditees to retain control and compliance, but also the auditors themselves get feedback on what works and what doesn't work. And we'll talk about why that's important in the examples. I tried to summarize differential privacy on one slide here, which is just not going to happen. Essentially, the idea is, if I add noise to my data, I'm going to purposely and intentionally corrupt how much data signal is in the data that I receive. And so this is a mechanism for guaranteeing privacy by purposely obfuscating in a very controlled way the data that is sent over. Now, so the extreme limit, I add so much noise that it just completely swarms the signal. So there is, that's that extreme. So it is in theory private, but also in practice useless because I'm just getting noise to analyze. And so the key concept here is this idea of privacy utility trade-off. I need to be able to understand how much noise do I need to add so that I'm compliant with the auditor's privacy policy. If I have more privacy, so like, without thinking through this, you might say, of course I want privacy, I'll just add all the noise. But then, like, you immediately we'll just get back the point that like, I'm just analyzing pure noise. There's nothing here. And so you need to think about the desired accuracy of the audit results. You want to think about the analyses, and for example, what Irina showed about outlier detection. This is clearly something that you need to think about whether or not you even want this to happen. Being able to review individual videos incurs a privacy risk that's very different from understanding bulk behavior of recommendation algorithms. And so that's something that needs to be discussed. And that's why the iteration process is valuable. Probably the thing you're all been waiting for, real results. So here's what I was given access to from LinkedIn about a small sample, but by LinkedIn standards a small sample, but to me 17 million rows of post activity on the LinkedIn feed. And here's what I was given. For each post, what industry does the viewer of the post work in? Does the post contain a job opportunity? Like if I reshare the post, is it linked to a job ad? Does the viewer of the post have at least a college degree? And in an internal flag, which algorithm decided to place the post in the feed? So this was what I was given. I thought about it for a while, and I thought the most interesting question here is whether or not there are patterns of viewer activity of the post based on user demographics. High-level answer is yes, and it is mostly in line with what the company expected. But the interpretation is tricky because it's very hard to find suitable reference points and bases of comparison. So that's something that will really come up, I think, in the future for all audits. Like, what is your basis of comparison? Something to think about here. How did I deal with the privacy budget? Maybe this is a little bit too technical, but I'll share it anyway. The key insight here was find in my code the thing that was the most sensitive, it had like the most detail, apply the privacy budget there, and then think of how I could summarize that quantity I just computed to get the results I actually want. We'll just leave it there for now unless there are questions. All right, results. So here's the first result. The activity of viewership varies across industry sector. So you see that on top you see the industries that are underrepresented on LinkedIn relative to their employment status. So what you're seeing here in blue is the LinkedIn post activity. What you're seeing in red is the proportion of employment in the United States in that sector. There are a couple of caveats here. So first of all, the data was not restricted to the US. So this is not quite a fair apples to apples comparison because LinkedIn data is inherently global. LinkedIn users are in at least 40 countries over the world. So it's a little bit of an unfair comparison to just use one reference point. Nonetheless, I think it is a reasonable point of comparison to at least explain this particular trend. So we see that government is underrepresented, service sectors are underrepresented, and then all the way at the bottom, these are the industries that are overrepresented. So maybe big tech, high tech is not surprising, legal is maybe slightly less surprising, finance was one of the ones that stood up that was quite interesting to me. Overall, the general pattern is in line with what the company expected. For example, you can imagine that it's consistent that government is underrepresented because government positions tend to have very strict social media policies on how they should communicate. LinkedIn really started in the tech industry, so it's perhaps no surprise that high tech really is heavy users relative to the employment base here. What's also interesting here is that if you look at the viewership in different industries, the educational levels in terms of whether or not they have a college degree also varies. And so you see on the top here, we see that the construction sector has the fewest number of viewers that have college degrees. All the way at the bottom, high tech and legal. Again, not too surprising. These are industries, after all, that require educational standards to be a practicing professional. Some of the industries less so than others. And so again, this is in line with our expectations based on how the employment and labor market works. Finally, here's posted jobs and how often they are viewed by industry. This was perhaps slightly surprising to me, was that all the way on the top is recreation and travel. So there are a lot of posted jobs that are viewed by this particular industry, at least in the data, even more so than high tech, although there is a margin of error that I can talk about. And then all the way at the bottom, legal and agriculture there. So it's interesting that the legal industry uses LinkedIn a lot, but not to find jobs. This seems to be the message here. So these were some of the examples of what I was able to look at. And really, I think the overall feedback I got was that it is consistent with what internal teams at LinkedIn are looking at in terms of economic activity and to the extent to which it is reflected in LinkedIn's internal data. So moving on to Dailymotion. Here's what Dailymotion gave me. About 10 million records of videos on Dailymotion. I got an ID for each video. I got also, interestingly, a ranking algorithm. So there are 3 ranking algorithms used by this company. They're just labeled A, B, and C for me. I also got how many times a video was recommended by the algorithm, and also a suggestiveness score. So 0 being completely safe, 1 being like extremely unsafe by the internal model. I just get the number, the score that's assigned. So I thought the interesting question here was, there are 3 algorithms being used. I get the number of times the video was recommended and the number of times and the suggestiveness score. Is there a difference between the 3 algorithms in terms of their pattern of promotion of videos? And does it correlate with the suggestiveness of the video that they score internally? Short answer is no, but there's actually a really interesting confounding variable, which I'll talk to about right now. Again, results, real results. It's always exciting to see. Here are the 3 algorithms. What you're seeing here on the y-axis is a scaled version of the number of times recommended. On the x-axis is a scaled version of the suggestiveness score. So again, to the left is less suggestive, to the right is more suggestive, and then higher up the y-axis, the video has been viewed more times. And so immediately you see that there is a big difference between the behaviors of the 3 algorithms. So algorithm A seems to be the one that produces most of the recommendations. It is also the one that seems to be the most agnostic to the actual value of the suggestiveness score. So it just does the recommendation, and the correlation with the suggestiveness score is practically 0. It's the R-squared is 0.001. So actually, this is I think a good null result, even though the fact that R-squared is basically 0 here is good. It shows that this algorithm is not posting more suggestive videos more frequently. But what I didn't understand at first was why B and C look like this. So B and C sit in the lower left quadrant of this graph, and so it basically says that both B and C place videos much less frequently than algorithm A, but they also post the videos that they recommend are also less suggestive on average. And it was only when I talked to my counterpart at Dailymotion that I learned that algorithm A is the main ranking algorithm. B and C are fallback algorithms. So these are only used when algorithm A isn't quite sure whether or not the recommendation should be posted or not. And so then this does explain to me this particular graph in terms of the fact that B and C are not very well used. It was not clear to us why B and C were only dealt with the very safe or like less suggestive videos. But this was an interesting finding that was part of the outcomes. So those are the results that I've seen. Happy to take questions. I thought I'd end with like, what did I learn as an auditor? It is not straightforward to use this platform as an auditor because I have to rethink the way I write my code. Data science is inherently exploratory. Exploratory means I have a terminal, I have a notebook, I'm going to try like 20 different things. I will see what makes sense, and then I finalize and freeze the thing that I want, and that's part of my record of findings. However, in this privacy-aware gated framework, you need to get approvals, and sometimes the approvals are fast, sometimes it's slow. It depends on the availability of my counterpart on the other side. But however long that takes, it's not as simple as run the code, get the answer, try again like 30 seconds later. Like that workflow does not work here. And so I have to think about how I write my code that is robust to that. And so I need to think about possible data distribution issues. I need to think about like error handling, like how will my code fail, and how can I preempt that by managing the possible failure modes before that. Because what is really frustrating is you write the code, you send it over, maybe it takes a week for approvals, you get back an error message. Right? Because that's just not productive for everyone. And so it is actually in my best benefit to figure out all the possible ways that the code could fail, try to mitigate that, or even just change the algorithms I use. Like I just use more robust algorithms that are tolerant to noise or some sort of unexpected deviation between the synthetic data that I was given and the actual data that was presented. So I'll just do a zoom in on just that one bit of like the realism of the synthetic data. So this is from the Dailymotion audit. The first row was what I was given in terms of data. So if for those of you who are familiar with statistics and data science, like you'll see like, this is nice data. And I'm using the technical term here. So the technical term for nice is that it looks very Gaussian, things are like kind of well spread out, looks like there's like data density in like every part of the space. This looks nice. And then on the bottom is what I actually got. Right? And so I have to really think about, like, given what I see on top, and that the real data could look like what's on the bottom, how do I write my code to properly anticipate that? And actually that's not that easy. So I need to think about outliers, I need to think about non-Gaussianity, I need to think about the long tails, all of this stuff. And like, we know that like the most toxic behaviors tend to be in the outliers, in the long tails. What does that mean if the synthetic data I'm given is not realistic enough to accurately model what happens that far out in the distribution? All of that we need to think about. Conclusions. Overall, I think this is successful. I am able to do the same calculations that mimic what internal teams do. At the same time, I don't have access to the data. Overall, to me, that's a good thing because I don't have to worry about data management. And that means that my company's liability as an auditor, like I can take that particular item off my plate. Auditors still retain control over approvals, as we have seen. The second thing that I think I learned was that domain expertise is not a thing you can ignore. And what this means for me, like my PhD is in physics. It's not in labor statistics. It's not in social media policy or like that kind of thing. I still need to rely on domain experts to validate my findings because just because I calculated something, I got a number, I got a graph. That's not the end. That's just the beginning of like that discussion of properly interpreting what that means in the context of the application that's being investigated. And where do these domain experts sit? Well, quite a fair number of them sit in the company being audited. And so we want to bring them into that discussion as well to make sure that their expertise is being adequately reflected. So this validation aspect and being able to bring in the in-house experts was a crucial aspect of both of these pilots. Like without the feedback from in-house experts, I don't think this would have been anywhere close to like this level of like fidelity to what they were able to do internally. Finally, as an auditor, I have to be disciplined in the way I write my code. I need to think through the way privacy is being consumed in my calculation. Of course, in a setting that I don't care about privacy, I never have to think about this. Now I have to think about this. And then the things that we talked about, like anticipate errors, anticipate differences in data distribution. What does that mean in terms of reducing the overall friction and waiting time? Because I don't want to deal with that, right? Like that's like something that really harkens back to the earliest days of computing. I did a little bit of computer history at some point, and this was a thing, like people used to send their punch cards to the server room, and they had to wait like 2 weeks or 3 weeks to queue up their calculation, and that's what they got, and that's the answer. So, it is going back a little bit in time in that way, that compute is not universally online and accessible, but I think it's a necessary compromise to make sure that we respect all the safeguards that the companies require. And with that, I'll leave it for any questions that people have. Thank you very much.
What I think we might do is take the questions and answers. If I can invite you to take a seat up here and keep your mic. A range of questions from what you've seen across the course of today. So, first of all, I think we should go into the next step section, and then I'll take it from there.
Thanks so much, David. And if anyone wants to grab one of those beers or wines or fruit juices and consume it while you're sitting as we do Q&A, the questions could get infinitely more interesting more quickly. But we're very happy for you to do that. We know we set a time for 6 o'clock for a stop and for drinks after that, but we're happy to keep answering questions during that time if folk are still interested. We might just kick into the next step piece now. Let's go to it. I might just kick off just a couple of quick points around the significant strides we've made. Do you want me to do that first, or just explain? Basically what we've just had described as phase one of the project, and the really big strides we've made in that over the course of the year since it was launched. That concluded in August 2023. The tool's been built, it's been put, as you've seen, through some multiple rigorous proof of function tests around things like privacy, security, legal, IP and reputation challenges. And we've moved on from test data to real data in that time and tested the tool on 3 online service providers. So we're now at the stage where we go, what's next? And that's phase 2. So we've been directed to do some work by Call Leaders, and Andrew and I will just take you through some of that work over the next few moments.
Very good. So I think one of the first technical upgrades here is you notice that all of the individual researchers are only working with data from one organization at a time. However, the next chapter of what we're looking at from a technological standpoint that allows for multi-stakeholder governance is where someone can download this kind of mock information from multiple different servers at multiple different organizations, design a joint computation that leverages multiple data sets, and then propose those back to the organization that's doing some type of joint, some type of combined analysis that goes into what's called an enclave. And an enclave is a special type of hardware chip that makes it so that, to grossly oversimplify it just for the sake of brevity, everyone who's contributing information kind of retains veto power over whether that computation is allowed to be used. So if I use data from organization A, B, and C, and I submit my code request into this enclave and they pull their data into enclave, the ethical kind of review process is that each organization would all have to sign off in order for me to do computation leveraging assets from all 3 places, if that makes sense. But they're able to participate without revealing their contribution to that computation to me or to each other, if that makes sense. And if you think about that for a second, you might go, wait a minute, but what if someone else's data affects how my data is used? And there's some kind of meta governance processes where they can actually do their own code requests against each other to understand aspects about each other's computation might affect it. So it does get a bit fuzzy, but TLDR is phase 2 really looks into joint computation.
And Call Leaders yesterday asked us to carry out a bunch of steps in phase 2. Governance framework, ethics accreditation framework, specialised research partnerships, methods for assessing models and facilitating models for researcher access, and then scaling the network out. If we look at the need for a governance framework, you can see just from some of the questions we've had around the use cases for this tool that there's a need to be very specific about how researcher access is put together, who is able to access the tool, how we do that for good. And we want to do that in a way that ensures we have a really strong multi-stakeholder input to it, because we think that's actually the best way of ensuring a safe experience for everybody, and that we get the right inputs on the way into the governance framework that mean that we stand up to rigorous examination as we work our way through. And we know it'll be tested very, very hard through that process as people start to run through test cases in phase 2. So the governance framework piece of this is going to be quite critical. It will also mean regular outreach to the call community. We will probably stand up some small groups as we work that through across the multi-stakeholder community, give us specialised advice on how to make sure the governance framework works well. Down this track, we're going to need to think about how we go from governance principles into enforcement of some of those principles through code. So there's a staged process we're going to have to work our way through.
Do you want to talk some about the ethics framework?
Yeah. So the second stage here is we're going to need some core principles that are applied to this project. We've got a number of them already thought through. Those who work in ethics and compute and privacy have a pretty good understanding of the key elements that need to be pulled in there. We will be working on that over the next 6 to 12 months to make sure that we've got the core principles for the project, ensuring it's used only for public good purposes. What we don't want to do is see the work that's being done here hived off into a proprietary construct. We want to make sure that this is a public good piece of computing, that it protects the privacy of users and the information held by platforms, and that it has an impact and helps to fulfill our core commitments. And as part of that, we want to make sure that the ethics framework builds in human rights, transparency and multi-stakeholder engagement into the process. The second part of that obviously means is that it's going to be critical that third parties we accredit to use the Christchurch Call Initiative on algorithmic outcomes and do work according to it or aligned to those principles, and that we're ensuring a real diversity of expertise and experience in that. But there is, I think, absolutely a need for a multi-stakeholder governance to sit over that accreditation process.
Maybe just to also comment kind of to the tech counterpart, as an ethics or governance framework comes together and members of the appropriate communities are able to say, here are the folks that we think should be chiming in on project reviews, on code reviews, who are the additional gatekeepers from across the community that should be triaging processes. What if some parties want to say no? Do other people then get to say yes? All of this can be embedded in the project submission infrastructure between the researcher and the network of different servers that are holding information. That makes it so lots of technical work to do there as well.
Yeah, and I will just come back to one point earlier. It was really interesting to me, even in the conversation I had with Henri as he left, that the 2 points, the 2 key questions that Andrew outlined right at the start are immediately subject to different interpretations depending on whether you're a technical specialist going, there's a binary choice here. Is this a question that should be asked and can it be? And a policy person where the boundaries between this, should it be asked or not, are actually quite different. So there is immediately a need for quite a bit of work across the community just to get that right and help people understand that, for instance, is it a legitimate question or not, goes to questions of legality, safe research, human rights, but then is encoded into something that's actually quite hardwired, it either meets the test or it doesn't. So there's a fair bit of work just to work through with the community, just to socialise those constructs and ensure that a technical perspective and a policy perspective are married up together.
And maybe actually to touch on something you said, Jiahao, it seems increasingly likely that all this is highly interactive. That it's easy to kind of throw up a chart that says they create a project, they submit a project, the project is approved. But it never really works that way in practice, right? There's a lot of back and forth on. If you think about the ethical conversation that we just had here a few moments ago, or the technical conversation in terms of how that question might be specified when in a multi-stakeholder environment.
Could I just say something about that? So I alluded to my previous work in banking, and I just want to point out that in banking compliance, engineers like to think compliance is a checkbox. This is a thing I need to get over to do the thing I actually want. In practice, it is very interactive. Compliance comes back with a whole list of questions. Say, are you sure you checked for this? Are you sure you checked for that? Are you sure there is no other alternative? And then this is about fact finding, so that we make sure that the legal process, the regulatory requirements are all satisfied. And so this is, I think, one thing to point out that I think we're seeing that play out even in this setting in a very, very different kind of use case. But still, it has to be interactive because no one party knows the answers to all the questions that will be needed.
As we do that, we're wanting to build our research partnerships so that we actually build a healthy and interactive community. One of the things we really liked about OpenMined when we started investigating working with them was that as well as technical specialists, they've got social scientists on board. They've got a range of folk coming from different disciplines, and the type of work we need to do and the research partnerships we need to build actually need that diverse set of expertise involved. As part of that, I think we will want to make sure that the tangible benefits of that research and a greater understanding of user journeys are evenly shared across the community, so there will be a process there of translating code through to actionable insights that policy folk across the community can start to think through as well, and that we can carry that research out globally across a range of different types of institutions or organisations, and that's a major scaling task over time. As it scales, we think the CCIAO may be able to support a wider set of questions than the initial core ones around terrorist and violent extremist content. We absolutely know one of the major issues in our field is algorithmic amplification that takes things that look like disinformation campaigns and end up with people operating in the area of violent extremism, and we're going to need to test that quite hard, but we think that there's a real benefit with a safe research tool about being able to get across that spectrum. It's one of the reasons we're really excited to see some new AI firms joining the call this week as well, as I've met with them over the past 6 months or so through the onboarding process. I've been struck by the number of social scientists that I'm finding inside those organisations as well. It's quite an interesting and diverse mix of skills and capabilities that is indicative of some of the issues they see with the technologies as they're working them through as well. And finally, we see scope with this to partner with funders and academic institutions on specific projects consistent with the principles that we've defined above around ethics and governance, and we've already seen a large degree of interest in this project.
Great. It just occurred to me when I skipped one thing. So OpenMined is a nonprofit, and all this software is free. It's like freely available online, open source, these types of things.
Which also appealed to us a great deal. We also see a real piece of work that needs to be done, as the call leaders discussed yesterday, with potential in working with foundational AI models to help improve content moderation and trust and safety. But there's a need to do really thorough and ongoing risk identification and mitigation studies to understand both the inputs and the outputs to those models and ensure that they're safe to deploy. And our sense is that the CCIAO, as it's developed, will offer some real potential to do that work, working with partners across the call who are deploying those models, and for studying input data in particular, and then for training and refining models. I'll throw that to Andrew to just cut that off.
Yeah, so from a technical perspective, I mean, everything that you've seen generalizes to software systems in general. You know, if you can run Python against it, then we can work on this type of context. So when we say AI system, don't think it just means a user log or a training data set or a PyTorch model or something like this. Any type of internal API or pipeline that code can be attached to can be made available through this type of infrastructure. And that really expands out what it looks like to facilitate questions about AI systems in there in the different contexts. Yeah.
Finally, I guess the last piece that we will want to do work on as we go forward is around ensuring that the work we're doing at the Christchurch Call Leaders on algorithmic outcomes supports regulatory models for researcher access. And there's actually a really interesting convergence of things like DSA and other models with the work that we've been driving. It tells me a couple of things. First, that we're actually on to the right line of inquiry and track in terms of trying to understand algorithmic processes and how user journeys work. Second, that convergence where regulators are working on this, where those of us in the Christchurch Call are working on it, will actually be useful and mutually reinforcing. And I was having a conversation just before this with one of the folk in the room around the benefits both of a mandated requirement for research, but also working on a voluntary basis across a collaborative community with multi-stakeholder input to make sure that's really safe. We in the team, as I said earlier, I get very excited about this stuff. I'm still working through my Python for beginners book. I may catch up one day. My wife gets very frustrated at the end of the night when I've made a minor advance with playing with code. She can't quite see the level of excitement that I can. We'll work that one out over time. But in a sense, I think that's something that we also want to work on as a community, building understanding across the community and ensuring the excitement about what we can do here and the necessity of making sure that that's a safe, secure process for everyone is spread across the community, and we can actually then start to deliver meaningful, substantive outcomes and reduce the barriers and costs for the community to be working with that. Andrew, any quick thoughts on that?
No, other than just to say, well, I guess I see alcohol is arriving as well. But it's been a real honor as technologists to learn more about what political scientists, social scientists, external researchers need, what legal policy security folks need. Like I think we as technologists, we exist to serve these communities, not the other way around. And also was particularly excited to see compatibility with some of the recent regulatory frameworks around access.
I guess what I'd say is it's been really exciting for us to be able to share with you a bit of what's been underway over the first year of the initiative on algorithmic outcomes. We're heading into phase 2, and the key message there is that that's going to require a whole pile of consultation and engagement to ensure that we deliver on the things that leaders have asked us to do. Two things I'd say about that. Over the next few months, we'll come out to the community more broadly. Second, the drinks are about to be served, and one of the reasons we separated drinks from the process of making live inquiries on a system is probably one that's reasonably obvious to everybody. That might be one of the first ethical considerations, that researchers shall not be drinking while they are interpreting or interrogating systems.
Can I disclaim that I did do part of the research in my pajamas?
That's all right, I wrote some of the Christchurch Call while in my pajamas as well. The others in the room, but that's because we were on the calls in the middle of the night to people. So there's a long story tradition there. Look, I think if folk have got questions and they're comfortable coming back with a seat and with a glass, we're happy to stay here and answer questions. We don't want to delay people having the opportunity of a drink, but equally we know that there's a lot of interest in this topic. So I think the 3 or 4 of us would be happy to stay here and answer questions while the rest of you have a glass of something nice. So feel free to grab something and come and sit back down again. We might make our way through some questions. There's one 3 rows back.
Hi everyone, Sébastien from Dailymotion. I just wanted to say a few words to thank the CCIAO for the opportunity, and also thank Jiahao and all the independent researchers. I just wanted to say that it's been an amazing project to be part of, and as you all have seen, it raised lots of really interesting questions. It also demonstrated that small or relatively small, mid-sized tech platform can play this, be part of this kind of project, and it's been really interesting to work on. I wanted to answer to a question that was asked over there, which was, okay, what about if you don't like the answer? Actually, it's part of the risk when you are trying to play the game with independent retention. You have to accept the risk. So for us, it clearly opened the door to not only to work with independent researchers, but also to open more our algorithm, and we are planning to work even more, and we are delighted that the CCIAO is playing this part with us, so thank you so much. More of a thank you than a question.
And thank you from us to Dailymotion. We know it's not easy to step into that process of working with researchers and finding safe ways to work things out, and we really appreciate the spirit of exploration with which you entered this. Next question, I think, is from Ardern.
Actually, before we jump in, can we just have, like, I know folks have started drinks, can we do a round of applause for Dailymotion and LinkedIn folks? Because that was sort of
awesome. Mine's not so much a question, it's really a statement. I'm glad to leave. Paul, I really must thank you and your team, because for the first time after March 15th, I'm actually seeing some real hope. And this is I'll convey back to my community. And the statement which really marked the difference is what you said, that you're a technologist, you're not in this other space. If we have this objective-driven, objective approach to evidence-based, assessment of what's going on there, it gives us a lot of hope for the future. And I'm really pleased by that, because it's the first time I'm seeing after March 15 some credible, real, substantive changes which are taking place on the online space. Thank you for that. And I thank you for my heart. And I thank you for my people, 51 who were killed. And it really makes a huge amount of difference. And I really want to tell you that these kind of things actually affect real lives. If you see what these people are going through now, 4 years after the trauma, your work and the work that Paul you're doing is actually really significant in the long run. Thank you. You're not just setting a new, you were saying, a world leader. You're actually world carer for us. And I mean that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. It's hard to know what to say in response to that other than Salaam alaikum. Do we have other questions from across the floor? I can see there are a number of tech specialists here and folk who I know would have lots of questions I'd like to ask. I saw Henri's hand up earlier, but he's putting his coat on. So.
I do have a few questions.
Yeah, please Adam, fire away.
So, first of all, this is amazing and incredible example of dealing with all of the objections and developing a system that seems to handle many of them very sensitively. I've already looked at the site, very interesting, really keen to understand more about the production of synthetic data and how in practice you deal with the privacy utility trade-off. I think that's wonderful for reading the documentation and everything else. So one question is, how will GenAI, or how could GenAI support this in terms of both the auditee and auditor, and potentially automating the process involved with that?
I'm going to leave that to the technologists.
So there's a variety of interesting use cases we're looking into. One in particular is, especially when the information is behind on the inside, is qualitative instead of quantitative. So it's images, this kind of stuff. So being able to translate that type of qualitative information into a quantitative or a qualitative insight, I think is something is LLMs in particular are well suited for, and GenAI in general is well suited for. This is an active area of research, a lot of interesting things to do, but that's one of the first ones I think we'll be looking into.
So I'll just be brief here. So I think the Gen AI challenge is not so much the generative aspect, but rather the fact that the answers that come back are no longer numbers or labels. It's images or videos or like just raw text. How do I even start assessing the quality of that? Is actually the first question, even before like, do I do it in like a privacy aware way? I think we're not even there to understand like what is a correct output. So when I ask Gen AI, like Stable Diffusion, make me a cat picture, what is a correct cat picture? I still need to define that. Doesn't really help me with that problem. And with the numerical work, like there's a sort of standard recipes I can try. So I'm like, the relationship between two variables. Okay, I start with correlation. If correlation doesn't give me the right answer, like the assumptions are violated, I can try increasingly more sophisticated tests. And that's part of the iteration process. Whereas for understanding what is correctly generated text, I think that we need more thought around what evaluation even looks like. So right now it's very binary. It's like, did you get the correct answer on the SAT model question or not? But really, like that's not the challenge. The challenge is, okay, write me an essay about the influence of religion on like the colonization of the United States. Like, how does a humanities teacher think about that? Like humanities teachers think about this every day in terms of what is an A grade essay, what's a B grade essay? How do I know that my students have learned enough to pass my class? We should be asking those questions and then asking what is useful to translate into LLMs and then what to translate into a privacy aware framework. And we need to start with number one first.
So I just wanted to say that I'm very excited to hear this. This was really amazing. I know that for the US government, it's been really, I think an objective that we work on something really concrete like this, a concrete project. And so I think, I can't speak on behalf of the entire US government, but I will say that I'm sure that all of us are very excited to see this. And there are still questions I have, and I'm still trying to completely understand this, but really excited about the first step. So thank you all for all of your hard work on this, and all our partners.
Just to echo, everyone thinks this is super cool and awesome, and I think as a researcher working on radicalization and everything else, when can we realistically get our hands on this and start kind of playing around? And how also do we make sure that the research actually benefits the community, the cause, and actually advances others getting involved. So it's not us using it for research that we get paid to do for someone else, but that it's actually being contributed into a larger sort of new corpus of understanding of this.
Great questions, Ben, and I might pick up on some of those. The answers to those, I think, come out of the multi-stakeholder process we need to run. We've got the imprimatur on that from leaders yesterday. You were at the table. They've signed off really strongly on pushing forward with this project. Some of that will also come, I think, with some of the work we're doing around funding. We've talked to some philanthropic funders who have a lot of experience at driving some open source type solutions, and they, the ones we've talked with to date are all very, very concerned with exactly that question. If they're to support this, how do they make sure that it is an open community? It's one of the reasons we're really excited to work with OpenMined, because we're talking open source, we're talking non-proprietary. What we want to do is make sure we can scale this and build critical mass in a way that actually gets that happening on a wider basis and makes sure that the momentum continues so that it builds out. But for me, the key is those sort of 5 slides we've just shown you around governance, ethics, research, community, regulatory measures and how they converge, and how we then ensure that we share the benefits out to the community. That's not an answer to your question, but it's a process that says we're committed to getting there. In terms of when that would probably come on stream, I think we've probably got 6 to 12 months of work to get that in place. We're heading into phase 2. It was intended to be a 2-year project to see how far we can push this and get this up and running. And we finished phase 1 in August, so I would say we're looking for the middle of next year, to the point that we're actually, hopefully, able to be getting some real research results back out to the community.
I'm just going to rove the festive mic into the festive part of the floor, so if anyone on this side would like to...
Could I just make one point that goes to Ben's point, and that is a comment that was made by Katie Vaughan at the table yesterday at the summit. And I might break a Chatham House rule here in a sense, but I think Katie's points were really important, and they were to ensure that this is part of a range of different research methods that we need. It's not a substitute for some of the other bits of research that are being done, but it should complement that. And second, that we build in those processes to ensure multi-stakeholder governance and multi-stakeholder input into the work. And I just wanted to, as we say in New Zealand, talk that comment, to support that comment, because it's actually absolutely where we want to head and demonstrated real convergence for us. So I think Katie's out there somewhere. Thumbs up. Thank you for the input.
Hi. Sorry. First of all, thank you. I was just echoing that it was great and fascinating, and really looking forward for the next step, specifically the next phase that you mentioned, because it actually have a very important component of extremization, radicalization, which is the cross-platform component, and how people, as you said, better than I was saying now. So the breadcrumbs and everything, that's very true. One comment, and not to discourage, just to, there were past experience with that, and if you're familiar with Social Science 1 by Facebook, that was very frustrating, and at the end of the day it comes back to the buy-in from the tech companies, and the past experience is about like their reputational risks, as much as I'm sure they really want to do it, but when it comes to reputational risks, they just block things. And there was another component with Social Science 1, and perhaps to encourage, when speaking about transparency and who is involved in the decision making of what is approved and what not, it's really important to discuss those questions, and I would say also to keep transparency there about what is approved and what is disapproved, because otherwise it would lose credibility within the researchers community, and that would kill the product, and that's very unfortunate considering the resources and the importance of things.
Thank you, Adi. I think those points are well noted and well made. It's one of the reasons we're really focused on keeping this an open source, non-proprietary solution and not seeing it bought into a company, and one that is available to a community of researchers. Andrew's got the most extraordinary vision for that we didn't quite manage to get into tonight, but I'm sure we will do as we go forward. I think that's really exciting. I would say off the bat, you know, it's taken a long time to get to where we've got to, and not all of the firms involved and the call are as excited about this as others. That's fine. What we want to do is work with those we can and then start to build this out. And I'd say we've been really pleased to work with Nick Pickles and the team at X. We've been really excited to work with Microsoft and the team at LinkedIn and Dailymotion. Stay posted for some other firms to look to participate in this over time. But what we want to do is consolidate the success and then grow it out. Will we get every firm globally wanting to be on this platform? Probably not. But will we get the critical mass of them that gives us really useful insights? Probably. And you've seen us be quite persistent and determined and take our time to get things right over time. So hopefully we'll do the same. Andrew and Jiahao.
Yeah, so I think I would like to respond to something that was in both of the previous questions. So, which is the role of the auditor as an independent, and like the independence of the auditor. So I want to point out that like algorithmic auditing is unlike traditional financial accounting in this way, because financial auditors are by law independent, and they have rights that the auditee cannot infringe on. We're not that mature yet in the algorithmic space, and so as an auditor, I respect the contracts I sign to get data access. This is going to be true of any access to any kind of sensitive data. I think anyone who's worked with medical data knows that like there are very specific rules you must follow. There are things you cannot do. There are things you have to disclose should you find vulnerabilities in the data. And we understand why those restrictions are in place. But there's nothing currently stopping an unscrupulous data provider. And I'm not saying that that either company I work with did this. I'm just saying there is the possibility that I may get a data source who in principle is cooperating, but the restrictions on what I can do with that data or report about that data is so restrictive that effectively I can't do anything. That is a risk. I don't know what the solution is, but since we are policy people in the room, I just want to point this out that like there's this question of like third party independence and freedom to investigate that I think will come up in the future.
I think that's a great point, because listening to your question, Adi, two things struck me. One, there's going to need to be quite a bit of maturity across the community on how it thinks about the questions it wants to put and the things it wants to understand through this tool. And there will be some that may go well beyond what some of our partners are comfortable looking at. One of the key things there is that we actually work that through in a thoughtful, mature fashion, that we look at the longer term benefits of standing up a system that works this way, and step our way through that piece by piece. I think the second piece there is goes to the question of transparency and the ability to actually find a way of being transparent with the community about the questions that are being proposed, the questions that are being asked, whether they meet the tests that Andrew's described, and being honest with ourselves about whether they meet those tests, because sometimes they may well not. We may have to have some hard conversations before they're put into a formal request and work through the code. And then some thoughtful and transparent ways of understanding what happens after that. So to me, there's quite a bit to work through there around building confidence and maturity and the way all of that works. Fascinating. From ICANN. Sorry.
Certainly. I'm a co-chair of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network, which is the civil society arm of the Call community. And these are my personal views. We have not discussed too much with CAN, but one of the emphasis that I see that you emphasize on privacy, but there are a range of rights that can be impacted when we are doing this kind of research and as a result of using this system. And so we need to look at that, and we need to look at what sort of other impact it could have on people's individual rights, but also what sort of like societal problems it could actually it could cause. The other thing is that you tell us that the process starts that you look at the question and see if it's legitimate or not. So you kind of like try to answer a governance question for us. And I think that with the governance board or whatever that we come up with, we have to think about the starting point. The starting point might not be the question. And that like we might have to change the design of the technology that you have, and the other thing is that algorithm, and you're more expert than me in this, but algorithm not only so there's not only one algorithm that causes a thing. So there's not, you're not really assessing one algorithm. You're doing a combination of things. And also not only that, but also we have to consider the user and how they manipulate the algorithm so it's kind of like, I know that you wanted to give us a simple example, but we have to like think about these things in a more, I encourage the colleagues to think about it in a more sophisticated manner, to think about what sort of implications they can have. And another thing that about the rights of people, algorithms are not, they also promote freedom of expression. They get people's voice heard. So we need to, when we come up with what would be the result of this research and what sort of like policy options or either private or government we are going to have, we have to think, okay, so yes, it might be harmful, but it might also give people a platform to get their voice heard. Thank you.
Fascinating. Yes. Thank you. That's really helpful, and I think all of that is possible.
Yeah. So I definitely agree that just privacy alone is not the only factor. In fact, my first work in this space was actually not privacy, but in fairness and explainability. So I'll just give one example of how these things interact that maybe will be interesting, which is understanding the privacy of people who, like minority groups that have been discriminated against. So there is a very fundamental tension between I want to assess discrimination against members of a particular group, and also at the same time respecting the privacy of that group, which could be very small as an absolute minority, but also the harms could be concentrated on that very small subsection. So the typical example that comes up in the US is assessing banking discrimination against Native Americans. Because they are so small in every market, they're like practically a rounding error in analysis in many, many, many parts of the US. And oftentimes they're just not measurable because we just don't have enough signal to measure that. And so, sorry. And then you add to that like the individual privacy, like of saying, I don't want to be identified. And maybe it's obvious if it's based on my race or my gender, but maybe it's like sexual orientation or like mental disability status, so like sort of hidden variables of membership is something that comes up. And do we believe that platforms even collect accurate enough data on these demographics? I think is one of the key questions that comes up all the time, because how do we know that a person is of this race, of this gender, even if they declared it themselves? Like, do we believe it's accurate? And if they don't declare, on what basis do we then try to infer their identity, and what harm are we imposing by miscategorizing people? So these are the examples.
Totally agree. The only thing I'll sort of restate is that as technologists, our job is to try to make the ethical conversation as clear as possible and get out of the way so that folks can make the ethical governance and decisions they want to be able to do. So nothing about this is prescriptive for a specific ethical framework other than trying to be inclusive to voices so that there's lots of flexibility in designing that framework. And you have lots of work to do.
Thank you, Andrew. You sure to be fast. Folks, I think unless there are other questions, we're well into the time set up for enjoying each other's company and having a beverage together. I'd like to thank you all for coming along and taking part. It's really appreciated that you've taken that much time out of a Saturday to come and watch Python script scrolling on a screen in front of you. I'm still excited about it, even at the end of that. I'd like to say just a huge thank you to you all for participating in the last 2 days of Christchurch Call meetings. There have been 4 of them: the Youth Reference Group, the Summit, this morning's Town Hall, and this afternoon's Algorithmic Outcomes Initiative Workshop. It's really humbling to us and really exciting to us, the passion of the community, but there's nothing worse than stifling that passion by getting between a community and a drink. So I'll stop there and say just a huge thanks.
There are some beverages to consume. We've been told by the Liberté that we have until about 8 o'clock. So I hope that you guys can enjoy a little bit of conversation, and thank you very much.